For the last several years, China has been pursuing a policy of zero COVID. This has worked surprisingly well for them. The lockdowns were very harsh, but the stated goal of keeping COVID in check was mostly working. Until it wasn't. They've recently abandoned zero COVID after a huge wave of protests, and now the Omicron variant is sweeping through the country. Joining me to talk about the Chinese Communist Party and their COVID policies is James Palmer. He's a deputy editor at the publication Foreign Policy, and he writes Foreign Policy's weekly China Brief newsletter. He's also the author of books such as The Bloody White Baron and The Death of Mao. We discuss how zero COVID worked, what eventually changed and forced the Communist Party's hand, how the Chinese public has reacted to all of this, and what it means for China, the CCP's legitimacy, and Xi Jinping. As always, if you want to support the podcast, you can do so on Patreon at patreon.com/Neoliberal Podcast. You can become a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. We greatly appreciate your support. We appreciate you listening, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and my guest today is James Palmer. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so I think a good place to start here is just to talk about the facts on the ground and what China has been doing over the past few years since COVID sprung onto the scene. What has China's experience been for the last 2 years? What strategies have they been using? And how would you describe their implementation of what we're all hearing, which is that they've been pursuing something called zero COVID?
So when the initial outbreak hit Wuhan in 2020, the response at first was to basically try and cover it up. It's still not quite certain to what extent the central authorities as opposed to the local authorities were involved there. But it was massively played down. Reports of this, new SARS were taken offline, doctors were censored, and so on. Once the Chinese government admitted the existence of the problem, though, it pretty much immediately went to very extreme measures, which successfully contained the initial outbreak. And this is what we think of now as zero COVID policy. At the beginning, it was a kind of messy collection of shutting down travel, locking people in their homes. A lot of it was implemented at the grassroots level when ordinary villages put up barricades and started to quarantine people themselves. And over time, it evolved into a much more systematic policy. Now, policy in China is often made at the top, but it's carried out by local governments. So even when something is systematic in the sense that the whole system is moving towards it, the guidelines from the top and so on, the implementation still very much is localized and is often quite different from province to province or even city to city. But certain strong characteristics emerged. The goal was to maintain zero COVID. So that meant tight quarantine on anybody coming into the country. It meant that any cases that were picked up were not only were the people themselves quarantined, their close contacts were quarantined. And it meant lockdowns if there was uncontrolled community spread, if they believed that the cases had gotten beyond a handful of people in a particular city or town. Throughout 2020 and 2021, this policy worked pretty well. The initial lockdown was very hard. It was psychologically very tough, especially since China was the first country in the world to lock down. But it only lasted for, about 6 to 8 weeks in most places. Parts of the country, even in January 2020, weren't under full lockdown at all. And people felt that they were doing something, that they were kind of coming together to stop this problem. And there was the memory of SARS, the first SARS outbreak. And so people really sort of saw a goal. And while there was lots of suffering as a result, there was a collective sense of achievement. And the government's popularity, insofar as we can judge it from the outside, which is always very hard in autocratic societies, really went up in 2020 and 2021. There was a certain amount of unhappiness in 2020 with the cover-ups over the initial outbreak with Dr. Li Wenliang and so on, who became a martyr, a hero. But in 2021, China could look at the rest of the world and see all these people dying of COVID, whereas the deaths in China had been, by the standards of a very large country, pretty minimal.
And so this is like a policy that had very wide buy-in from the population and from the elites that are actually kind of the ruling class, and obviously from Xi Jinping himself, but just wide buy-in from kind of all sectors of society.
Initially, yes. Now, of course, there are always exceptions, but up to, I would say, at least the end of 2021, most Chinese had bought into the policy and saw it as a success. There was a lot of kind of gloating, to be honest, over the way that the fact that other parts of the world were in lockdown, or that people were dying of COVID in other parts of the world. There was a lot of fear of traveling abroad because of the fear of catching COVID. There was also frustration because many people's businesses were choked off as a result of international quarantine. Tourism was destroyed and so on. But generally, people saw themselves as doing the best they could under hard circumstances and believed that the government had adopted the right policy. Now, of course, that was helped by an immense wave of government propaganda, constant reinforcement of the idea that this was a great Chinese success story. And this policy became very closely associated with Xi Jinping himself. And he seems to have been a really major advocate of it from the start. Now, my own theory on that is that Xi's mother is in her late 90s. She's still alive in Beijing, and that he very much did not want to see her dying of COVID. And I think that possibly that fragile parent really affected the way he evaluated this stuff.
Really, like a one person's kind of relationship with his mom determining the fate of a whole country. I mean, I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but still.
Yeah, I mean, you can interpret it charitably, which is that in a lot of countries, like the UK, the value of elderly life was implicitly written off in early government policy. There was a callousness towards the lives of the old that you see in like the Cobra decision making by Boris Johnson and so on. And so, maybe like having somebody very personally aware of that isn't necessarily a bad thing. But that zero COVID also came with a kind of hubris, and it was also politically warped by the Chinese government's need to pretend that the outbreak hadn't started in China in the first place. So, for instance, you got this big emphasis on the idea that COVID could be imported via parcels or via the frozen food chain, both of which are complete bullshit. But the government has repeatedly claimed that COVID was imported into Wuhan in the first place and actually began in the United States or elsewhere, has repeatedly claimed that, COVID is actually the result of US bioexperiments and so on, sometimes kind of hooking up with American right-wing conspiracy theories as a result. And so that meant a big emphasis on touch transmission, which basically doesn't exist for COVID, on sterilization and so on. So a lot of unnecessary wasted effort.
I remember seeing lots and lots of pictures of like people in Beijing and other cities, I guess, in full hazmat suits outside, like spraying down public streets, which, to me seems ridiculous.
It was performative to a large extent, though at the start of the pandemic, it made sense because we really didn't know how spread worked. But by the time that we had a pretty good idea of it, these measures were really about kind of putting on the display. And about maintaining the pretense that this could be transmitted by touch, and it required these sort of extreme measures. Now, the Chinese government also, and I'm not certain if this still is the case, but they used to claim that not a single member of the PLA had got COVID, even when the PLA had been deployed in Wuhan to help with the initial outbreak. So there were all kinds of, propaganda bullshit claims going on there.
All right, so I have one more kind of historical question, and it leads us up towards the present day. And that is, I guess, was the median experience for an average Chinese person really as draconian as it sometimes seems watching over here? Because I'm fully aware that we see like some really crazy stuff going on, but it might not be the median experience. But you do see, reports of like, oh, there were times when people, 1,000 people were all just locked in this tall apartment building together, and there's no food in the building anymore, and they can't get out. And, there's people who are literally welded into their homes and stuff like that. And number one, is that true? And number two, was it getting worse in 2022, or were the reactions to it getting worse? And like, did that lead into what we saw happen eventually?
Well, that's the thing. There's a big shift in 2022. And, we'll get to that in a moment. But I'd say on the extreme claims, a lot of them are pretty dubiously sourced. Like the welding people into their apartments does seem to have happened on a couple of occasions, but people have sometimes mistaken welding entrances shut in order to create a single point of entry and exit from an apartment building that can be monitored for closing the entire apartment building from the outside, for instance. Now, when you were locked down, you were locked down on a scale that's inconceivable in the US, much more conceivable in Europe, where the lockdowns were much tighter, where, the police were out, on the streets looking for people breaking lockdown. You were fined pretty harshly in the UK if you violated lockdown without like a good reason, a good cause. In Italy and Spain and so on, you were genuinely confined to your house. Apart from they usually allowed you a walk once a day. The difference in China is that most Chinese people live in a much more controllable environment than people in the West. And this isn't just in terms of surveillance. Obviously you have all these surveillance systems, most of which did not function before 2020, most of which were turned off in order to allow normal life to proceed. So, for instance, you had in big Beijing compounds, you would have facial recognition at the gates that was supposed to only let the residents in, and that guests had to register and so on. But those systems were almost never turned on because they were so annoying. Like if you had a delivery driver come, you didn't want to have to walk down for 15 minutes to go to the main gate to pick up your delivery. You wanted the delivery driver to be able to come in and, go to your apartment. But all those systems were there, they were present, and they could be turned on for COVID. More importantly, though, was really the urban landscape. Most Chinese people live in compounds. They live in big kind of gated communities where there's walls around the apartment buildings, and there's several gates in the walls, but those gates could be closed down or reduced to a single point of entry or exit that could be monitored and controlled by the local neighborhood committee. The system of volunteers or semi-volunteers that the Chinese government uses to both to monitor communities and to do like what we would think of as city council work, local government stuff, all this sort of thing. So these compounds can be very big. There can be literally tens of thousands of people in one compound. But they allow people to be sealed off and areas to be contained in a way that just isn't possible with the urban landscape of the West. And so most of the time, if you were in lockdown, you were in lockdown in a community. You were in lockdown within one of those like big gated compounds. So there's normally stores, shops inside the compound. And there were food shortages in the initial outbreaks. There were medicine shortages, but they were mostly not critical. It's hard to tell because, of course, Chinese news is very censored. There do seem to have been cases of people who were totally neglected, whether they were separated from family or they were very old people. It does not seem to have been a mass phenomenon at first. But 2022 saw big change, and the big change was the coming of Omicron. And Omicron spread so much more quickly. You'd always had these little kind of outbreaks that had been fairly easy to contain within the existing system. Now, though, the Chinese government was seeing these like really big outbreaks, particularly in Shanghai and other major cities caused by Omicron, and they were adopting increasingly draconian policies to try and contain it. The government was still so committed to zero COVID that every possible outbreak had to be stamped out. So you had, for instance, the quarantine policy, and by quarantine here we don't just mean being like staying at home. We mean going to a centralized quarantine facility, being like warehoused basically for 2 to 3 weeks to make sure to keep you away from other people and potentially provide treatment. And that policy was extended not only to close contacts of COVID cases, confirmed COVID cases, but to close contacts of those close contacts. So one COVID case, say, you had one COVID case and they had met with, 20 people, while they were potentially infectious. And then each of those 20 people has met with another 20 people. So that's 400 people in 420 people, 421 people if we count the original person, going to quarantine because of one COVID case. And now extend that up to, busy cities with hundreds of potential contacts, where to the case numbers getting to the low thousands, and you had all these people being quarantined. But beyond the quarantine, you had mass lockdown being imposed. So entire cities were closed down to keep COVID from spreading. And while in the case of the first outbreak, there had been this sense of like, we're getting through this, we're in this collectively. Now the lockdowns were becoming so regular and so endless that people really lost any sense of commitment or like collective purpose. So the urban Chinese really strongly turned against zero COVID policy over the course of the year, especially after the big Shanghai lockdown when, food was running low, when medical supply chains were broken, and where there was just a sense of, no end in sight. Rural Chinese stayed generally much more committed because lockdowns were much, much rarer. And so there wasn't that sense of kind of threat, of risk. There was still in that 2021 mentality. The other big thing was that mass testing became even more prevalent. Now, there'd always been a mass testing policy. You'd always had like these legions of people deployed to test literally every person in the city, going door to door in a lot of cases. So I've had several phone calls to China being interrupted by mass testers showing up at guys' apartments to swab their tongue, do a quick test and so on. It was just a very routine part of the day. But it also, you also had to constantly prove your COVID-free status. And that could require going to like test clinics to get PCR tests, where you would queue in line for hours. It was incredibly intrusive and annoying. And all this also came back to the app system. Now, the app system was a series of apps, one for each city, municipality, that basically contained your current COVID information, were updated, if you tested positive, if you had been in contact with somebody who tested positive, and so on and so on. And they not only made life in the city quite annoying, they made it very hard to travel between cities because sometimes the data wasn't shared correctly between cities. Sometimes your code flagged orange or even red when you went to a new city anyway. So daily life just became more and more inconvenient. And as you had more and more Omicron cases popping up, it became clear that this was never going to stop.
So how did the first protests begin to happen? Because my sense of China, and I don't know that much, I consider myself like a moderately educated person, but I have no expertise here. My sense of China is that large-scale protests just are very, very rare, and especially to last more than a day. And so, number one, I guess, is that true? And number two, how did they start in this instance?
So big protests aren't rare in China, but nationwide protests are very, very rare. And sustained protest is very, very rare. So it's very common for Chinese people to protest over local issues, and it's quite effective. Because, autocracies are often, in fact, dependent on protest as a feedback mechanism. Because they lack the feedback mechanisms of democracies, direct action becomes much more normalized. So people take to the streets to protest like property tax, for instance. Property taxes have been rolled back when pilot programs were attempted because very middle-class urban residents who the Chinese Communist Party depends on, had taken to the streets. Or earlier last year, you had the bank protests where people who had basically been ripped off in a series of online Ponzi schemes protested in order to force the government to recompense them, which succeeded. They got at least partial recompense because, again, the government is very sensitive about social stability and very sensitive about protests. So while it's a very risky tactic, because it's quite common that a few people will get jammed up by the authorities after the protest, it can often succeed at a collective level. But you very, very rarely get any kind of direct challenge to the government, and you almost never get nationwide protests, get people protesting on the same issue, because both of those raise the implicit threat level to the government. A local protest is a local problem, and the people protesting would often frame it expressly in terms of the central government policy says this, but the local authorities have done X. Zero COVID always had the potential to become a nationwide issue. The government didn't quite seem to catch on to that at first. They shut down local protests in Shanghai and so on. They sometimes altered policy in response to local protests, but they didn't shift the government's stance as a whole. They made noises about how zero COVID was going to become dynamic zero COVID after the party congress in October, and how it was going to be a more flexible policy. But there weren't any signs of that really on the ground.
A question I have is, I compare this to Tiananmen Square, and I assure you it's because the only wide-scale Chinese protest I'm aware of is Tiananmen Square. Mm-hmm. And so it's the one thing I would compare it to. But then at the same time, I realize, it's the one thing I know. Maybe it's not actually a very good comparison. Is that an accurate comparison to make, or is there a better comparison?
It's not. So I would say the thing is, it's not really that the protests were anything like the Tiananmen Square protests. The Tiananmen Square protests lasted for months. There were protests that lasted for weeks or months all over the country. They had very big ambitions. So people were always comparing these protests to Tiananmen. You had these lines which were true. These are the biggest protests since Tiananmen. But that doesn't mean that the protests actually looked anything like the Tiananmen protests, or that they really strongly resembled them politically. It was just kind of a point of comparison of scale. It's sort of like saying, it'd be like if you said that 9/11 was the biggest air disaster in the States since, I don't know, some crash that killed 80 people. It's true, but it doesn't mean that the two are really comparable.
What caused the CCP to actually change their minds here? Because they have shifted. They are no longer doing zero COVID, and we're going to get into how bad things are, which appears to be quite bad. But was there a specific incident, or was it the threat of more unrest, or what caused them to finally say, we've got to give this up?
So there seem to have been three things that happened. One is that the economy has really been dire, and the economic numbers were looking increasingly bleak, and you clearly had a faction within the CCP that was pushing for some kind of change to get the economy restarted. They, however, were on the back foot for a long time, and in fact, a couple of their members, or people we think were in that faction, were ousted during the party congress. But then you had this big wave of protest. And these protests came as a result of a fire in Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang, the western Chinese region. Now, Xinjiang has been the site of a massive Chinese crackdown on the rights of the Uyghur, the main ethnic minority in Xinjiang, who have been, sent to camps, imprisoned, oppressed, had Chinese forced into their homes, had their religious practices, their cultural practices destroyed, all of this. There's a kind of sensitivity around Xinjiang as a result. And a lot of Chinese are faintly aware that something bad has been happening there, but have not been able to talk about it or voice anything about it. And that added a kind of weight to what then happened, which was that a fire killed at least 10, maybe quite a few more people, including children, in Urumqi. The fire was immediately blamed on zero COVID policy. We still don't know if that's actually true or not, but there were claims immediately after the fire that firefighters had been prevented from reaching the building because of zero COVID barricades, that the buildings had been unsafe because there were so few exits, and so on. The second part seems to me to be very likely to be true because there have been multiple complaints about fire safety risks as a result of exits being sealed to create, again, single entry exit points. That caused 3 waves of protest within the course of a weekend. The first wave of protest was in Xinjiang itself, where crowds turned out across cities to protest the local zero COVID policies, and they immediately forced a partial rescindment of lockdown in Urumqi itself. Not anywhere near full openness, but some compounds were freed up, stuff was rolled back. You then had a wave of protests that were against zero COVID as a whole, and which were essentially a bunch of local frustrations and anger. People destroyed barricades. They yelled at the Dabai, the big whites who are the COVID enforcers. They're called the big whites because of the big white hazmat uniforms. And just like this outpouring of anger across the country. So protests in dozens of cities of different scale. And then you had a small but important group of protests that explicitly went beyond just anger at zero COVID to openly calling for the end of the Communist Party, the removal of Xi Jinping, this kind of thing. And those included protests in university campuses, which of course have been exceptionally sensitive since Tiananmen. And the combination of those 3 waves of protests seems to have really shaken the government, caused them to begin to rethink this. But what ultimately caused them to go back on zero COVID policy, I think, they went back on December 7th, a couple of weeks after the protests, is that zero COVID policy had failed and there were already mass outbreaks occurring in that first week of December. Now, we don't really have good data on this yet, but going by by Friday, it was the zero COVID policy was ended on Wednesday, and by Friday, a quarter to a third of Beijing was testing positive. I mean, going again by anecdotal reports, literally by calling friends and seeing if they had tested positive.
That's of course, far too fast for if nobody got infected Wednesday night or Thursday morning and then was testing positive by Friday. Exactly. It must have happened. Yeah.
Yeah. So it must. So my strong suspicion is that the final straw was literally that they were looking at the numbers, and the numbers were, we think, pretty accurate throughout most of the first few years of COVID. Definitely the numbers around the initial outbreak were juked. The death rate was played down. The infection rate was probably played down. So I think what happened was that they were looking at the numbers and they realized that this wasn't sustainable. Now, that doesn't match up with the public numbers, but by that point, the public numbers were probably being manipulated. China has been reasonably good with COVID data for a lot of the pandemic. It was very bad at first. They probably played down deaths very severely in the initial Wuhan outbreak, played down spread. But because zero COVID was obsessively focused on tracking every case, they really do seem to have been reporting and tracking every reported case. But that must have shifted sometime around November from the looks of it. And they just began putting out numbers that were much, much lower than the situation on the ground was actually showing.
So essentially what you're saying is that they realized we're about to get hit with a massive wave, and you kind of have a choice. Either we can abandon zero COVID and then get hit with the massive wave, or we can just have the massive wave break zero COVID and then we'll lose face on top of it or something like that.
Exactly. And I think also they wanted to be able to blame the protesters a little bit. To say, well, you made us do this, basically, as a backup position. They haven't quite gone all the way on that, but they've been allowing people to blame the protesters online while censoring other stuff.
I would love to, I want to come back to that because I would love to discuss that. But before we get into their response, how the CCP has responded, what's their messaging strategy, logistics, and all of that, let's just talk about like how bad are things right now? Because we have to think about, what is the scale of the current outbreak in China over the last 2 weeks or so? And number two, I guess, how do we even know? Because it's very difficult to get information on a sensitive topic like this out of China.
So we don't know what the numbers are. We know that there's a huge outbreak. We get hints of numbers. So the figure of 250 million infections in the first 20 days of December, which apparently came up during a semi-internal meeting between a Chinese government official and healthcare workers, has been going around. So have figures of, 1 million infections a day in particular cities that were put out by like local governments and then removed from online. But the government has been just putting out fictitious figures since the start of the full outbreak. That's most noticeable on deaths. They claim that there have only been 12 deaths. This is complete nonsense. It's an almost surreal level of lying.
A million cases a day and 12 deaths. That is
a million cases in one city. We're probably talking something like 20 to 30 million cases a day across the country, maybe more. It's not just these like little bits of official information that come out accidentally. It's also stuff like just seeing the percentage of people who say they've tested positive in particular cities when asked, the disappearance of medicine from the shelves, the overcrowding and overflowing at ICUs and hospital sites, not at fever clinics, interestingly, but because Chinese tend to skip the clinic level and go straight to the hospital when they have any kind of medical problem, even a relatively mild one. And crematoriums are backed up for days. So we've seen the obituaries for like moderately famous, well-known elderly people in Beijing peaked in December. People in their 70s and 80s were suddenly dying at several times the usual rate. And so we're kind of seeing all these clues, all these signs of this mass outbreak, and everybody in China knows there's a mass outbreak because everybody around them has COVID. But the official numbers have just stopped recording anything. And the official policy is that only direct deaths from COVID, no underlying conditions, nothing else, count towards deaths. Even with that kind of very weird framing of deaths, the number still doesn't make sense. They're obviously just leaving out a bunch of cases. But also people are apparently not trying to avoid putting COVID as a cause of death because they fear that it'll mean that they can't get the body cremated, all kinds of things. So maybe, there are estimates out there that we're looking at 9,000 or 10,000 people dead a day. There are estimates of tens of millions of cases. It is definitely a huge wave. It appears to be BA2 and BA5, I think, were the confirmed variants, which have fatality rates of about 0.3%. So if we're looking at that level of spread, then we're talking about probably 1 to 2 million deaths accumulating in the next 6 months or so, which is in keeping with the Chinese government's own estimates of the zero COVID era. There were multiple reports that said, there will be like 1 million COVID deaths if the policy is loosened.
It's a staggering number. And I mean, obviously China has a lot of people, so that's why some of the numbers are so big. But, regardless of politics, I think the first thing we just have to recognize is that it's a human tragedy on a mass scale that we're going to have a million or 2 million people die of this. And
it's a huge scale of loss. And, people I know have lost grandparents. Now, the thing is, of course, like absolute numbers have a force of their own. We do have to remember that if you were to take US COVID deaths and scaled it up to China's population, you would be talking 4 to 5 million deaths if the US per capita rate was transferred to China. So to some extent, I'm like, well, there were always going to be a lot of deaths. There was always going to be a point at which COVID policy failed and a bunch of people died just because China is so big. But you look at countries like South Korea or Vietnam or New Zealand, which also all exited to some degree zero COVID policies, Australia. And they exited with a much lower scale of death per capita because they put a bunch of effort into vaccinations. They put a bunch of effort into building up the hospital system and the healthcare system. And they were able to kind of like slow the outbreak when it happened, whereas China's just been wildfire.
Yeah, and you led me directly into what I wanted to ask next, which is like, look, the original conception of lockdowns, as they were explained to us in the West at least, was the idea of flatten the curve, that we need to keep this thing under control for a little while until we can, get a vaccine or just, not have everybody get sick at once so that we like overwhelm the hospitals. That's the idea of like flatten the curve. And, once the hospital system seemed like it was more robust and it had capacity and we started to get vaccines and we started to get stuff like Paxlovid, then the case for opening up is a lot more obvious. And so you're essentially trying to buy time early in the pandemic. But it kind of seems like the Chinese government has put this heroic effort into buying as much time as they possibly could, but that they didn't actually do anything with that time. Like they never accepted Western mRNA vaccines. And there seems like other stuff that they just haven't done very well.
Pretty much, yeah. Now, Chinese vaccines aren't nothing. Like, Chinese vaccines are effective. They're just not anywhere near as effective as Western vaccines, as mRNA vaccines. So they put a bunch of effort into getting country vaccinated. They got vaccination rates up to 80% or so for 2 shots. But they kind of lost effort with the booster campaign. The booster rate is not high, and it was difficult to get elderly people vaccinated in particular because a lot of them live in the countryside. They're hard to reach. There's a big kind of reluctance against vaccines in China because there's been multiple safety scandals in the past involving, like pork production, deaths, and so on of non-COVID vaccines. Like goes back for decades. But zero COVID ate up so much energy, took so much time and money. Something like 3% of Chinese GDP was going to mass testing alone during the zero COVID era. That there wasn't anything kind of left over to do the other stuff. So, in fact, China had less healthcare funding, less healthcare expansion during the COVID years than elsewhere. And China has a very, very low rate of critical care beds. It has about 1/10 of the critical care beds per capita that the US does. So this was a huge gap that needed to be reached that wasn't reached. You remember you had all this talk of like, oh, China's building hospitals in 2 days in the Wuhan outbreak. Those weren't hospitals. Those were basically quarantine facilities, centralized quarantine facilities. They didn't have actual equipment or even personnel in a lot of cases.
Yeah, it's easy to build a building in a very quick time. It's less easy to train a nurse or to build a ventilator,
Exactly. And it wasn't even really, in most cases, it was basically like China cleared out the space and set up a bunch of tents. It was stuff that the US Army does, but talked up for propaganda reasons and swallowed by Westerners who are very given to believing the kind of like, China sneezed and it built a canal overnight kind of stuff. So you had like this failure to prepare because all this energy was being put into zero COVID, and not just into zero COVID, but also into the run up to the Party Congress, a big political event that was held in October. So officials were having to spend time like studying Xi Jinping thought and engaged in like internal party politics to make sure that their place was secure, and monitoring the population, engaged in the kind of constant civil society suppression that has been the hallmark of the Xi era in general. So between that and zero COVID, they really didn't have any time left over to, do their jobs.
Can I ask a question here? Because this is something I've heard. This is a theory from somebody. It's not mine. But again, I'm not a China expert, so I'm just kind of repeating something I've heard, and I'd love you to verify this or tear it down. One of the things I've heard is that, we can sometimes picture China as this like vast totalitarian state, but that in many ways the state capacity is actually not very high. That they do a couple things really well and that they really care about. They spend time censoring social media or enforcing zero COVID. But when it comes to the nuts and bolts of like getting things done, they're actually like very deficient in just the state capacity to accomplish stuff, other than a few key areas.
I would say that there's enormous state capacity, but there are enormous barriers to using that state capacity. So when something is directed from the top and there's a clear kind of political drive towards it, really remarkable things can be achieved in a relatively short time, like the initial lockdowns. Or like, for instance, the cleanup of Beijing's air around 2016, 2017, where Beijing went from being an incredibly polluted city to having quite clean air nowadays in the course of basically, a year or two. But there's so many layers of stuff in between, so many layers of local government, so many different concerns, so much corruption, so much need for officials to be engaged in this constant process of scheming and backstabbing to maintain their own position, that on an everyday level, stuff often doesn't happen. So you look at, the condition of Beijing sewerage, for instance, where, and this is a city that is the flagship city, sewerage quite often bubbles out of the ground, where there were mass floods as a result of rain a decade or so ago that drowned people in their cars. And that gets even worse when you look at the local government level. When you go into the countryside or the small towns, you find these just appalling safety scandals. It showed up during COVID actually in an interesting way, which is that the lack of financial support. So European countries and the states provided, in fact, very generous financial support to the public during lockdown. In the United States, it was achieved, mostly through, the PPP loans and through extended unemployment. But it created, this huge, rise in and surprising, decline in poverty in the United States as a result. In Europe, it came mostly through the government, stepping in and paying salaries. You didn't have anything like that in China. You had attempts to fund businesses in some cases, but they got very caught up in local connections. A lot of businesses closed down. A lot were very badly hit. A lot of people were really financially starved by the lockdowns, and the ability to provide aid to ordinary people was much more limited than in the West.
Was this caught up in that system? There's some particular term for connections that's often thrown around.
Yeah, it's. I mean, look, it's guanxi, but that's a whole nother podcast. What does that actually mean?
Yeah, not to lead you down too many rabbit holes. But.
Yeah, it's just that connections matter everywhere, but they particularly matter in the Chinese system, I would say. And the hidden connections, the kind of covert power, is very, very strong, particularly at the local level. So, you have this, tremendous potential to do things, but in reality, that's often not the case. And even when you have the big projects often come with costs that are very high as well. So, very good example is the high-speed rail. Now, China stole high-speed rail technology from the Japanese for the most part, but then built within a few years a fantastic high-speed rail system. And that high-speed rail system also went something 3 or 4 times over budget during the construction, and there was so much corruption involved in the building of the high-speed rail system that the entire Ministry of Railways, once an extremely powerful ministry with a decades-long history, was abolished because it had become so rotten.
I mean, I want to make fun of that, but also if I look at American infrastructure projects, they're all going 3-4x over budget too. So
yeah, without even getting built in a few years. So
in our case, it's not even corruption as much as it is just like local NIMBYism makes everything impossible. But with maybe a dusting of corruption.
And would I take like some guy getting very, very, very rich in exchange for a high speed route from New York to Chicago? Yes, absolutely. In a moment, I think that cost would absolutely be worth it. But again, it's the small stuff that's often like neglected or undoable, and it's often neglected exactly because officials have to spend all this time like fucking with people's lives in other ways, maintaining lists of people who go to church, censoring posts online, going to companies and telling them that they need to have Communist Party branches in them. Like all this stuff, really burns up energy.
All right. So I'd love to know how the CCP is kind of reacting to this massive outbreak, because, maybe in some level this was always inevitable. Once Omicron got here, there's no regime that can contain Omicron. And I'm curious about a few things. First, I wonder how the messaging has been with the CCP. Are they covering the outbreak as though it exists? Are they pretending it does not exist?
And they're basically they're basically pretending the outbreak doesn't exist. If you watch the flagship news program, there are almost no references to it. It's all, Xi Jinping is great. Xi Jinping is wonderful. China is, producing more crops than ever, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's standard propaganda stuff. And they're just leaving out COVID, or it's being relegated.
Is there a thing you have to do as kind of a China watcher? And I don't even know if that's the right term, China watcher. But, back in the day, we called it Kremlinology, because you would know if the Kremlin said the harvest was stupendous, it was actually stupendous. And if they just said it was great, it means there's going to be a famine. Are you kind of having to do a little bit of that with like reading the tea leaves of like what they actually mean in some of these newscasts, or?
So it's not so much that it's mostly just that they're not talking about it, or that they're talking about it in a minimalistic way. I mean, we do a lot of that. We do a lot of like, we do look at it at kind of the weird wordings of official media for clues, but that's mostly about internal party stuff. For what's actually happening on the ground, we look to everything from local reports, social media, personal contacts. We try and use less tainted sources of data, particularly local data rather than the central stuff. And we sort of see what we can get. So again, estimates in a lot of cases of numbers have literally been just like how, out of the, 40 people I know in this city, what percentage have COVID? Which is very, very crude and not very accurate, but it's often the best we can do. Watching at the moment the official news broadcasts are, it feels as if they haven't quite worked out how they're going to portray the COVID situation. That at some point they probably will start addressing it more directly, but they haven't really worked out a clear narrative for it yet. And that clear narrative will ultimately depend on having a villain who isn't the Chinese government. What they are doing is a lot of stuff that's like, your health is your own responsibility. That was one of the big slogans. Like, you are the first person in charge of your health, was a slogan that started being pushed in November. And that's clearly trying to take away any sense of, the government being to blame for this. They've also started to massively downplay the danger of COVID. And this is a surreal contrast with, a few months ago when you had people being like, well, Omicron, the West says Omicron is weaker, but Omicron is still very serious. I mean, we must diligently work to maintain zero COVID policy because hundreds of thousands of people could die. And you had people saying long COVID is a real problem. And now you have people saying that the main doctors in the country saying, oh, long COVID is all psychological, and actually the danger of getting COVID today is extremely minimal. And, there have been people that I know of personally who have believed those messaging, and as a result did not take strong precautions like masking and so on that some other families took, and then got hit by COVID and had family members die. So I think that's going to cause a real trust crisis for a lot of people, because the government is telling you that everything is fine, and you can visibly see that nothing is fine. That hurts credibility. And so I think the government will in turn shift its messaging, find some way of acknowledging how bad things have been, but I don't know quite how it will do it yet.
Well, so one thing you mentioned a few minutes back was the idea that, well, the protests happened, they opened up, and then a big surge happened, and so they might try to blame the protesters. Is that something that might happen? Or because there's a thing like, to make an analogy to Russia, one of the things that happens in Russia is there's lots and lots of criticism of the Russian war effort. They're extremely critical, even on state media. But what they always do is they go after somebody who's like beneath Putin. It's some, second or third level flunky, and they get mad at him and he gets fired. And you can't say anything bad about Putin, but you can say bad things about other people. I'm wondering, is there any sort of analogy like that in the Chinese system, or is it more like, no, just you don't criticize the CCP at all? Or like what's...
So you can go after local governments. You can basically portray local governments as having failed, the central government. Can't really go after the central government except when a big figure falls. Then there's a whole kind of, then he becomes sort of open.
We were never at war with East Asia kind of thing. He was always corrupt. He was always bad. Yeah.
Exactly. And the truth is they're all about as corrupt as each other, but it's the ones who lose in the political battles who go down. And I'm sure a lot of the things said about them are true. The mistresses, the stolen money and so on, but I don't think they're any more true of the guys who lose than of the guys who win. But you get... Okay, so the propaganda line, I don't think they're going to fix on the protesters. I think they experimented a little bit with that, with allowing people to go after them online, like by not censoring them. But Xi's New Year's address was like, there are many, this is a big country and there are differences of opinion, which seemed to suggest some kind of like leniency towards the protesters, towards people who had criticized zero COVID policy. And I think like ultimately like the fact that zero COVID policy was so unpopular means that they probably won't take that line. They won't say, well, zero COVID would still be here and everything would be fine if not for you. I don't think they can do for that. I think like it also makes them look weak. They're never going to implicitly admit that the protests played a big role in changing government policy. Especially they're not going to say like, you made us do this and now this has happened, because it makes the government look like a failure. It makes the government look weak. Because it's so closely tied with Xi Jinping, I don't think that they can do the thing where they like blame it on somebody else, where they're like, oh, actually so-and-so was enforcing zero COVID all along, or was in charge of building up the hospitals. Now, it might be that you have like a political fight about other things, about power in general within the Communist Party, and then they kind of try and lump some of the stuff on whoever ends up falling. But I think that would take like months. I don't think we'll see anything immediately.
Well, let me ask about Xi specifically, because this was really associated with him. And when it was working, he was taking it as a personal victory. Does this weaken him at all? Or is his hold on power so strong that like it's embarrassing, but ultimately like it doesn't really hurt him at all?
I would guess the second. I would think that it does feel to me like he's been weakened in internal party stuff. And that if there's any ability for people to unite against him or kind of return to a form of collective leadership in part, this is it. But we don't know enough about the internal workings to see any clear route for that. He's surrounded himself with his own people. Now, your own people in China, I think people can sometimes overestimate the loyalty that results from like being attached to somebody. But the main thing he's done is really made sure to put in people who don't have a strong power base apart from him. So it's hard to see who would take power if he falls. It's hard for anybody to make the case for themselves, this kind of thing. I would say that his credibility has been badly damaged, that the sense of him as a leadership failure is actually pretty strong among the Chinese elite. They blame him, in my experience, for the economic slowdowns, not just of COVID, but other problems, for the tech crackdown and so on. But I don't know if that translates into any form of action, because he's got his grip so tightly on most of the levers of power. It's hard to see a clear route where this could turn into like him actually falling.
There's a related question I want to ask, and I think you were kind of you're dancing around this, around what I'm about to ask. There's a quote that I've read, and I'm going to mangle this, but it's from some historian of the United States talking about the Vietnam War. And the essential nature of the quote that I don't remember fully is, before Vietnam, all Americans agreed on certain things. America is the good guys. You can trust what the government tells you. We're all in this together, this kind of spirit of America kind of thing. But then afterwards, after Vietnam, we no longer had that sense of like shared truth. And the government didn't have that kind of unquestioned legitimacy. And I think of that, and I think of, is there the possibility that, the CCP, which has kind of been propped up by this agreement for several decades, that like we're going to make China prosperous and successful, and in turn we're going to be in power and you're not going to question it. The kind of, I'm glossing over a lot of
the
stuff.
The implicit contract, yeah.
Yeah, the implicit contract that I'm simplifying here, but is there a risk that like the shared truth of that implicit contract could fray as a result of the last few months?
I don't think it will be COVID that frays that, because COVID comes back to the questions like, do you trust the government on like health and provision and so on? And I would say there was already a lot of distrust of the government. There were already multiple incidents that made Chinese cynical about the government, but cynical in a way that mostly served the government. Cynical in a way that mostly caused them to think nothing can be better. There are no other alternatives. This is the best anybody gets. And that was a result of the kind of disillusionment of the Tiananmen generation in multiple ways, combined with, enormous new wealth in a lot of cases. So that this kind of like, well, there are no values and nothing matters, but look after your family and we're making money at least. I do think that there's a real sense of that, of the prosperity contract fraying. Now, of course, like that's always been a kind of like assumed idea. Like nobody's ever, the Chinese government never laid this out. It always leaned on legitimacy in other ways as well. It sold, it said we're making you rich, but even more, it said we're making China great again. We're, restoring the natural place in the world of the Chinese government, and we are carrying forward the grand mission of socialism. So you essentially had three pillars, like economic prosperity, ideological legitimacy, and national legitimacy that held up the Communist Party. Now, for a long time, ideological legitimacy was a very, very shrunken pillar because so much of that was, ditched in practice as a result of the economic changes, even though it was still very strongly emphasized in the language. And economic prosperity was the main one, with national legitimacy, national greatness, pretty close behind. But now economic legitimacy has really shrunk. And that's not just COVID, that's the whole shift to, out of being a developing economy into a middle income economy, and the sense of sort of economic slowdown of transitioning from being an 8% growth economy to maybe a 3 to 4% growth economy. That was hitting even before COVID. The government has tried to substitute ideological legitimacy and national legitimacy as a result. And that's been pretty successful on the national legitimacy front, on the kind of, wolf warrior stuff, like China is feared and respected worldwide stuff. Not necessarily in terms of China's actual popularity worldwide, which has gone extremely downhill in the last few years, but in terms of selling it to the Chinese public, selling the idea of Chinese strength. They're also really leaning on ideological legitimacy. They've really, Xi has really strongly emphasized like socialist ideas, if not actual socialist policy, and dragged up a lot of the old Mao era propaganda stuff, doubled down on hostility to foreign ideas, foreign cultural products, all this kind of thing. And while it's worked in terms of shutting out foreign cultural products, I think it's worked much less than they had hoped for in terms of like actually convincing people that there was some there. And so they're going to be left leaning on nothing but nationalism, and that could potentially be very dangerous.
All right, we're coming up on time now. So I want to ask the traditional final question that we always ask on this podcast. And that is, where can people go to learn more? they're interested in China and in the topics we've been talking about today, what would you recommend for them to read or to research that you think would be helpful? And I'll start by just saying, obviously, they should read James Palmer at Foreign Policy. He writes China Brief. He writes a lot of stuff there. That's the first recommendation. I'm happy to recommend you. But other than Foreign Policy itself, is there anything else that you would recommend for people who are interested?
4 sources I'd recommend for sort of regular reading. One is Bill Bishop's newsletter, Sinocism, which is a very long-running kind of roundup of the news in China with, along with Bill's analysis, which is extraordinarily useful, read by everybody in the field, read by anybody with any sort of real interest in China studies. Then the China Media Project, which monitors Chinese media, looks at censorship and so on, is often extremely revealing. And 2 Chinese sources, Caixin, which is the main kind of business magazine and which does very honest reporting within the limits of working within, Chinese media, but has very good business reporting and tries to do as much reporting on other stuff as it can. And Sixth Tone, which is an English language only site, which is also state media, but has been able to do like some really good reporting and critical stuff. Now, you have to read those with the knowledge that they are censored and with the knowledge that there are limits of what they can do, but they still manage to get a lot of insight in there.
All right. Well, we will make sure to link all of those sources in the show notes, in the description. We'll also give a link for people to sign up for the China Brief newsletter if they want to sign up for that. I am always curious to learn more about China, and I'm really glad we got a chance to talk today. One more time, our guest today was James Palmer. James, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.